Hey, good morning, church. How are we doing today? Today we are officially wrapping up our When in Romans series. Over the past several weeks, we've been walking through the book of Romans together, not just on Sundays, but if you've been able to, many of us have been diving a bit deeper with the 31-day Romans devotional as well. If you've been journeying through that with us, first of all, thank you so much for pressing in there. And secondly, we genuinely hope that you enjoyed that study and it's been a useful tool in understanding the book of Romans a little bit more. So as we've journeyed through Romans, we've discovered that Romans just isn't a theological book. It doesn't just teach us about Christianity. It's a transformational one. It teaches us how to live. Right? Paul just isn't explaining doctrine. He's helping us understand what it looks like to be changed from the inside out. And so today, before we step into the final section of Romans, I want to take a moment to look back at what God has been building in us over the past few weeks. You see, Romans builds layer by layer. It builds truth by truth. It builds transformation by transformation. And so the first thing we discovered in Romans is that we are all broken and that we all need a Savior. Right? Paul makes this clear early on when he writes in Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Not some people, not just the really broken, super jacked up people, not the people who feel far from God. Paul says all, every one of us, there's no exception. No one is exempt. No one's too far gone. But also no one fixes themselves. Right? We all stand on level ground at the foot of the cross. And so Romans begins by reminding us that before transformation can happen, we have to acknowledge our need for Jesus. And then from there, we moved into another major truth, and it's this, that transformation does not come from trying harder. It comes from trusting God. Right, Romans 5:8 says, but God demonstrated his own love for us, for that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Amen. God didn't wait for us to clean ourselves up. He didn't wait for us to get our lives together. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That means that transformation in my life begins with grace, not my effort. It begins with surrender, not striving. Romans reminds us that we don't earn transformation, we receive it. But here's the thing. Even when we're trying to do better at trusting God in our lives, that doesn't mean that we still don't struggle. And so I don't know about for you, but what Nick spoke on in week 3, about how we all struggle with battles, but the only way to win them is to shift our focus towards God, man, that really hit home for me. The words Paul writes in Romans 7, I do not understand what I do, for what I do, I don't want to do, but I hate what I do, and the things I do, I want to do, I don't do. And if I'm being honest with y'all, that really resonates with me, because that's my life. Like, I want to get better. I want to grow, I want to change, and yet time and time again, I keep finding myself in the same struggles, the same battles over and over and over and over and over and over again. And so Paul explains that the way forward isn't just to try harder. It's to shift our focus. And then last week, Pastor Shaq preached, right? He preached that God's plan are so much bigger than our detours. So I just want to say this. If you are in a detour season right now and you missed last week's message, you need to go to our website, illuminatenj.com. You can actually leave and go watch it right now. It was so good. Right? Click on the messages, watch the one from last week, because it was such a powerful reminder of the way that God works all things according to his purpose for the good of those who love him. The victories and the setbacks and the detours and the disappointments, God wastes nothing. Even when we don't understand what he's going to do, God is still working on a bigger plan. And what's powerful is this, that everything that Paul has been building up to until this point, the first 11 chapters of Romans that we've worked to until now, lead us to where we're stepping into today. Because after 11 chapters of theology, after 11 chapters of truth, after 11 chapters explaining what God has done for us, Paul begins to shift gears. Here's why he begins to shift gears: because belief was never meant to stop at belief. Romans 12 is where belief becomes behavior. Romans 12 is where theology becomes transformation. Romans 12 through 16 is where Paul begins to show us what a transformed life actually looks like, and it begins with surrender. Paul writes in Romans 12, he starts this way, he says, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." Now, I want you to notice how Paul starts that. He says, "Therefore." Right? That word matters because what Paul is saying is that in light of everything we just talked about over the last 4 weeks, in light of all of the first 11 chapters, in light of God's mercy, in light of God's grace, in light of salvation, therefore, here is how you respond. He says that in view of God's mercy, our response is surrender. This is where transformation begins. It doesn't begin with behavior modification. It doesn't begin with trying to become better people. It begins with surrendering our lives to God. Transformation begins with surrender. In fact, Paul urges believers to offer their lives as a living sacrifice. Now, when we look at that through the lens of the people that Paul is writing this letter to, that's a striking image. Because when Paul talks about sacrifice, everyone listening would immediately understand what he meant. A sacrifice was something that was fully surrendered. A sacrifice wasn't partial. A sacrifice wasn't convenient. A sacrifice was complete. So Paul says that's what transformation looks like. Not just believing in Jesus, but surrendering your life to him. Not just Sunday mornings, but everyday life. Not just the spiritual parts, but your plans and your relationships and your priorities and your time and your decisions. Transformation begins when we move from control to surrender. But if we look, he doesn't stop there. Right? The next verse he goes on to say, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good and pleasing and perfect will." In other words, transformation doesn't start with behavior, it starts with thinking differently. Paul tells us that transformation happens through the renewing of our minds, which means before my life changes, my thinking has to change. Before my habits can change, my perspective has to change. Before my direction changes, what I'm focused on has to change. And this is important because so often we think that transformation happens instantly. But what Paul is describing here is something deeper, something ongoing, something that happens every day. You see, when we read Romans, I think more than anything else over the last month, this is what I've learned, that transformation in my life is not just a moment, it's a process. It's not just one decision. It's a daily surrender. It's waking up every day and saying, "God, I trust you today." It's walking into uncertainty and saying, "God, I'm going to surrender this to you." It's facing challenges in my life and just saying, "God, lead me. I don't know what to do." Transformation begins with surrender. But what happens when we surrender? What happens when we see the mercy and the grace and the goodness of God? What happens when we begin to place our trust in him more and more, day by day by day? When we actually begin to live and offer ourselves as living sacrifices. You see, what happens is that kind of transformation doesn't just stay inside of us. It begins to creep out externally. It begins to change how we see ourselves and how we see others, and it begins to reshape our posture. And so if we look here in Romans 12, the first place Paul says transformation shows up is in humility. Paul continues in verses 3 to 5, and he shifts this conversation from surrender to humility. After calling us living sacrifices, Paul immediately addresses how we have to think about ourselves. He says, for by the grace given to me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. For just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members don't all have the same function, so in Christ we through many form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. What Paul says to the believers is not to think of themselves more highly than they should. But instead he says, think of yourself with sober judgment. I love that language there. Think of yourself with sober judgment. Have you ever met somebody whose ego was so big it's like they were drunk on themselves? Right? You know the kind of person I'm talking about? Stop, don't do that. Don't look at them right now if they're sitting near you. Paul says, look at yourself with sober judgment, with humility. And what's interesting is that humility, the way Paul describes it, isn't thinking less about yourself. It's thinking about yourself correctly. Transformation changes how we see ourselves. You see, before transformation, we tend to compare. We tend to compete. We tend to elevate ourselves or diminish others. But transformation, it produces humility. It produces a steady confidence that comes from understanding grace. Because when you're reminded that you didn't save yourself, when you're reminded that you didn't earn grace, when you're reminded that God met you in your brokenness, it changes your posture. I become less prideful because I remember just how jacked up I can be. I get less defensive because I remember that I'm fallible. I get less self-focused. Now notice I said less there because I really struggle with this one. But I focus less on myself because I begin seeing the value in the people around me differently. Right? Paul continues by reminding believers that we're all part of one body. Each person has different gifts. Each person has a different role and a different purpose. And this is important because humility doesn't just change how we see ourselves, it changes how we see other people. You see, transformation helps us celebrate others instead of competing with them. Transformation helps us value people instead of comparing ourselves to them. Transformation helps us realize that we all play different roles in what God is building. I'm just going to stop for a second and just say this. I think our world is in desperate need of the kind of transformation and humility that only comes from a life surrendered to Christ. The kind of humility we're talking about right here is essential to build community. Man, the things we see in our world, pride divides. Comparison divides. Competition divides. But humility almost always creates unity. And so what Paul is saying here is therefore, if we've experienced all the goodness and mercy of God, therefore in this process of transformation is going to take place in us. And one of the first places it shows up is in our humility. You see, when transformation begins to take hold in our lives, humility has to follow. And what I love about this particular point that Paul makes is that it follows the example of Jesus so well. Jesus, who would be offered as a physical sacrifice for you and for me. As we head into Holy Week, we begin today with Palm Sunday. And Jesus enters Jerusalem. And he doesn't arrive with status or spectacle. He enters in humility. Right? Matthew 21 says that Jesus came gentle and lowly riding on a donkey. You see, this would have immediately stood out to everybody watching because kings and conquerors, they didn't ride donkeys, they rode war horses. They entered cities with power and force and dominance. But Jesus chooses something different. He chooses humility. He chooses gentleness. He chooses peace. And in doing so, Jesus demonstrates the very posture that Paul is describing in Romans 12. Because humility reshapes how we carry ourselves. It reshapes how we walk into rooms. It reshapes how we interact with people. Here's the thing. Jesus didn't come demanding attention, but people noticed. He didn't come elevating himself, but people honored him. He didn't come with power, but he changed everything. You see, humility is a different kind of strength. So as we celebrate Palm Sunday, we're reminded that transformation doesn't just change what we believe. It changes the very posture of our lives. As Paul continues in Romans 12, in verses 9 and 10, he shifts the topic from humility to love. He says this, he says, love must be sincere. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good, be devoted to one another in love, honor one another above yourselves. You see, as we go through this process of transformation, what it does is it begins to reshape our hearts. It doesn't just change how we see ourselves, it changes how we treat others. And so Paul begins with something that's simple but powerful. He says love has to be sincere. Essentially, be authentic. Be real with each other. We should be devoted to one another in love. And what's interesting here is Paul isn't just describing a feeling. It's not the mushy-gushy kind of love. He's describing a way of living. He's saying transformation in you is going to show up in love. This is where Romans becomes incredibly practical. You see, Paul's not talking about the big spiritual moments. He's talking about the everyday responses. He's talking about how we treat people in the ordinary moments of life. Transformation shows up in how we celebrate somebody else's win. Amen. Transformation shows up in how we sit with someone in their pain. Yes. Transformation shows up in how we listen. Transformation shows up in how we respond when it's inconvenient. And so what I just want to say is this, that transformation is not just about how we worship. That's not it. Honestly, that's the line of thinking of how Christians and the church have gotten a bad rap because we worship one way on Sundays and then we live completely differently the rest of the week. Right? Transformation isn't just about how we worship. Transformation is about how we treat people. Because if we're going to be real, this is where things can get difficult because loving people isn't always easy. Right? Especially when you're dealing with difficult people. I had one of those moments this week, true story. This happened to me on Thursday. I was at a store and I only needed one thing. And you ever go into a store thinking, man, I only need one thing. It's going to take like 2 minutes. I'll be in and out. Famous last words. So I grab what I need, and the self checkout shut down, so I have to get in line. And there's only one person in front of me, and their cart's pretty full. But I'm thinking, oh, this is great. I'll be out of here in no time. I was in a hurry trying to fit it in. But then it starts. The person in front of me pulls out a stack of coupons. Not like 1 or 2 coupons. I'm talking about a stack. Like they brought their entire filing cabinet with them to the store. And they start flipping through them slowly. Like they're reading a novel. The cashier scans something, it doesn't work. And now we're calling for a manager. And the manager comes over, and now they're debating whether the coupon is expired or not. And now we're debating how we can stack a manufacturer's coupon on top of the regular store coupon. And now there's a conversation happening about, well, the last time you let me use this, and I'm just standing there holding my one item, watching my 2-minute trip turn into like a National Geographic documentary. And I could feel it happening. You know what I mean? That like internal shift. At first, I'm patient. But then I start checking my phone for the time over and over and over again. And then I'm sighing. At first just a little, but then louder and louder and louder until the people around me think I'm having some sort of asthma attack. Then I'm doing the thing where you shift your weight back and forth. Like that's gonna somehow speed things up. And now I look behind me, and there's a whole line of people forming. And now I just feel like we're all in this together. Like we've become a community of oppressed people, silently frustrated by the coupon lady, but unable to say anything about it. And in that moment, I can tell you plainly that I am not thinking loving thoughts. I'm thinking this is why self-checkout exists. And right as I'm standing there, and feeling all of this, I remembered what I was working on this week. Transformation, love, and patience. And I remember actually thinking, standing in the line, so frustrated, thinking, if this is it, I suck at this. Like, how am I going to teach on this on Sunday when I'm clearly failing the test? You see, it's easy to talk about transformation. It's easy to talk about love. It's easy to talk about grace. But real transformation shows up in the everyday moments just like that. That's why Paul reminds us in Romans 12, do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. What he's saying there is sometimes people are going to suck. Sometimes they're going to do things you hate and that make your blood boil. But as far as it depends on you, love them anyway. As far as it depends on you, treat them well. Live at peace. And I don't know about for you, but for me that's hard. Because people are hard. People misunderstand. People disappoint. People move slowly in checkout lines. And my natural response is just frustration. My natural response is impatience. My natural response is to just let it all show. But this process of transformation, it changes that. It changes how we react and how we speak and how we forgive. You see, transformation doesn't just show up in the big spiritual moments, it shows up in the everyday ones. Transformation in my life shows up in the checkout line, in conversations, in frustrating moments, and in dealing with difficult people. You see, when transformation begins to take hold in your life, love becomes the evidence. And this is where I think it gets even more powerful, because this isn't just Paul's idea. This is exactly what Jesus said would define his followers. In John 13, Jesus says this. He says, a new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Just think about that for a second. Jesus doesn't say that the world is going to know you're a follower of him because of your church attendance. He doesn't say the world will know you're my disciples by your worship and how you raise your hands. He says the world will know that you follow me because of your love. That means love isn't just something we talk about. Love is something that identifies us. It's how the world sees Jesus in us. It's how our faith becomes visible. It's how transformation is recognized. Which means the way we love people matters. How we treat difficult people matters. How we respond when we're frustrated matters. How we choose grace matters. Why? Because love is the evidence of transformation in our lives. And ultimately, this kind of love just points back to Jesus. You see, the greatest act of love was never just something that Jesus taught. It was something that he demonstrated. And so as we move towards Easter, we're reminded that Jesus didn't just tell us to love. He showed us what love looks like. Love that moves towards broken people. Love that forgives when it's undeserved. Love that sacrifices when it's costly. Love that gives everything. And that love, it led Jesus to the cross. You see, Jesus didn't go to the cross for perfect people. He went for broken people. He went for difficult people like a lady in a checkout line. He went for people like me, and he went for people like you. He didn't just talk about love, he embodied it. He absorbed the hurt. He cried out and still chose forgiveness. He would give everything, every breath in his lungs until there were no more breaths left to give. And for a moment, it looked like the end. It looked like love had lost. It looked like hope was gone. It looked like the story was finished. But it wasn't. Because what looked like defeat was actually just the beginning. And next week we step into that story. Because what happens next changes everything. Will you pray with me? So God, we come to you with just humble hearts. God, we acknowledge that so often we fail to be identified by our love, God. And so we just pray this morning a simple and humble prayer. Help us. Help us love the people around us better. Help us treat people better, God. Help our mind go to you in times of frustration. Remind us who you call us to be. In your holy and most precious name we pray. Amen.